climate emergency is the greatest existential threat of our time, and we are running out of time. Executive Director Inger Anderson of the UN Environment Program stated, "The science is clear that if we keep exploiting wildlife and destroying our ecosystems, then we can expect to see a steady stream of these diseases jumping from animals to humans in the years ahead. A direct correlation between the climate emergency and the current pandemic in which we find ourselves." She went on to say, "To prevent further outbreaks, we must become more deliberate about protecting our natural environment. It is clear that the climate accountability and climate action is essential to preventing even future pandemics. And it's clear that without acting on this emergency, we will increasingly experience food and water insecurity, income crises, conflict, and even further global conflict. It's the infinite cost of climate change that will continue to rise unless we act now. The climate emergency poses a serious threat to our environment, our economy, our health and safety, and at the forefront of this issue are Indigenous peoples. And the government has even acknowledged that, Madam Speaker. In fact, preambular paragraph in Bill C-215 acknowledges this. It states, "Whereas the implementation of the declaration can contribute to supporting sustainable development and responding to growing concerns relating to the climate change and its impacts on Indigenous peoples in reference to the full adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples." And these impacts of the crisis are already being felt in Canada, particularly in the Arctic and along our beautiful coasts, disproportionately impacting Indigenous nations, rural communities, and marginalized and racialized communities. This is what you call environmental racism. Indigenous and northern communities, farmers, and food producers and others have been sounding alarms about the impacts of climate change on our ecosystems, on deaf ears of consecutive Liberal and Conservative governments who have failed in their duty to protect our beautiful Mother Earth. The climate emergency, we know, is now impacting our food security, and Indigenous people across these lands are amongst the most impacted, disrupting traditional ways of life and food security, especially in remote northern communities, where the warming up of our climate at a much faster rate is impacting traditional food sources. Not only that, when you take away people's subsistence, you force them to find other ways to acquire food, forcing remote communities to rely on expensive imported food alternatives, leaving individuals only being able to afford unhealthy food options. That has a negative impact on health. So it's not surprising that there is a correlation between physical wellness and the impacts of the climate emergency. And in addition to this, it goes beyond just climate, but the kind of violence, the increased rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls as a result of resource extraction projects that bring workers into our communities, perpetrating violence against Indigenous women and girls, a crisis that was confirmed in the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. We need to act now to respond to the calls to justice. Indigenous people have experienced the greatest impacts of the climate emergency, and so it's not surprising that many Indigenous peoples from across this country, even as we speak in the House today, are on the front lines fighting against the climate emergency. Reconciliation and fundamental Indigenous rights, the rights that are articulated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and environmental justice go hand in hand. So, with all due respect to my colleague, the fact that she didn't even mention the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in her bill is shocking. Not only that, I think we see the impacts of climate change. We see the impacts on emotional health, particularly of young people that are fighting to keep our world healthy. And people are tired of governments committing to targets and then missing them again and again and again. And we are running out of time to turn things around. With Bill C-12, we will not be on track to meet our international climate obligations. And we need an action plan that honors our international climate commitments and obligations. And we need a plan that addresses the urgency of the climate emergency. So although the current government proposed Bill C-12, the Canadian Net Zero Accountability Act, it is not consistent with agreements we've made with the international community. There is, for example, no target for 2025 and no real accountability measure for the next 10 years, even though we know the next decade is the most critical. The accountability mechanisms, including the advisory committee, are weak and relies on the Environment Commissioner, whose office is already underfunded. We will not achieve climate justice without accountability. So it was surprising to me, although there's many good parts of the bill, that there was nothing in that the accountability measures put far too much power in the hands of ministers that have a history of destroying our environment and not taking environmental stewardship seriously. Now, the NDP has a long history of pushing for greater accountability of governments pertaining to their actions to fight climate change. I put forward, for example, Bill C-232, which provided a clear accountability framework, which calls on the federal government to take all measures necessary to address the climate emergency. For the first time, it's a piece of legislation that pushes forward a clean, safe, and healthy environment as a human right, which would be enshrined in law with the federal Environmental Bill of Rights. We have other examples: Linda Duncan, Jack Layton, Megan Leslie. We need to work together to push forward a bold climate agenda. We are running out of time. Thank you very much.